It is said, in the scattered records of the mountainous region of Pinehollow, that certain silences remain more intact than any wooden wall. Before beginning, the narrator simply invites the viewer to indicate, in the comments, which city they are watching from and what time it is at that moment, maintaining the same reverence that surrounds this old archive. The remaining pages on the case of sisters Maren and Eliza Hartwell, born in the late 1870s and missing in the spring of 1901, carry the kind of restrained language that is observed when a community prefers to relegate an event to the distance of memory. Both were adult women, discreet, with simple habits, and an almost imperceptible presence in the valley surroundings. They lived in a narrow beechwood house built by their grandfather, in a remote strip where the wind swept down through the tall grass and where the slopes always seemed to be covered by a persistent fog, even in the driest months. Pinehollow, at that time, was a place with few families and long intervals of mistrust. The community was guided by unchanging routines, the limitations of the land, and the constant need to preserve every bit of sustenance. The isolation was not only geographical, it was a cultural trait, a tacit agreement not to interfere where each person's life began and ended. Thus, the Hartwell family never stood out or generated much comment. They lived apart, and that seemed to suffice both for them and for their closest neighbors, who usually spoke only when necessary, when they occasionally passed by the narrow path that led to the cottage. Early records state that Maren was the eldest, known for her serene demeanor and skill with sewing, producing sturdy blankets that sometimes made their way to small local trade fairs. Eliza, 2 years younger, was seen less often. She was described as someone who observed more than she spoke, withdrawn into reading worn books that she kept hidden in a cloth bag. Both remained unmarried. Some oral accounts collected decades later indicate that they cared for their mother until the end of her life, and that, after her death, they maintained a silent routine between themselves that few dared to interpret. The weather in early April 1901 was described as unstable. Mornings began with a soft glow over the grass, still damp from the winter thaw, but afternoons brought irregular winds that swept through the ravines with enough force to bend the younger trees. It was in this environment that the first signs emerged that something would alter the usual order of things. Months before the disappearance, some residents reported noticing a change in the sisters' routine. Maren's prolonged absence from the markets, Eliza's almost total reduction in trips to the small wax and flower exchange point, and the way the lamps in their house seemed to stay lit for long periods of the night, even when there was no apparent need. It was unusual for such an isolated home to attract attention. However, a specific entry in the county records, dated April 11, 1901, would pique the interest of historians years later. The record, written in hurried handwriting and with stains obscuring part of the paper, mentions that 27 travelers rested in the Hartwell sisters' loft during the previous night. It is a brief note, almost a comment lost among other notes from the local patrol. But nothing in any other archive in the region explains who these travelers were, where they came from, or why they would seek shelter in that remote house, whose existence was barely marked on maps. The mention seems out of place, as if it had been recorded without confirmation, and even today it intrigues researchers for its numerical precision and its total lack of context. When confronted with the surviving testimonies, this detail becomes even more unexpected, as no one in the vicinity claimed to have seen any unusual movement that night. There are no signs of horses, carts, or footprints to support such a claim. Only the brief isolated note scattered among other routine records. The last preserved page of the initial block of documents ends abruptly. It points out that the following morning, only silence remained in the upper loft and throughout the Hartwell property. And just below, in a sentence that almost seems like a hastily added note, an officer wrote, "None of the women were found." What happened between the supposed arrival of those anonymous travelers and the silent dawn remains, to this day, one of the most disturbing gaps in this forgotten rural archive. In the months leading up to their disappearance, the Hartwell sisters' lives proceeded with the usual tranquility of the valley, marked by small repetitions that, observed from a distance, seemed to constitute the entire meaning of their days. The cottage where they lived, with its light wood walls and sloping roof, was almost always protected by the shade of the ancient trees that surrounded the property. Every morning, Maren would open the front door just after the first rays of light touched the dirt floor. She used to let the cool breeze circulate through the narrow kitchen before lighting the stove and preparing a kettle of water for the two of them. Her movements were always calm, a silent choreography of someone accustomed to solitude and the tasks that arise from it. Eliza, in contrast, took longer to appear. Many oral accounts mention that she would appear on the porch only when the sun had risen a little, carrying a book pressed against her chest and a gaze that wandered across the valley as if seeking to interpret the distance. Some neighbors who passed sporadically by the road claimed that they rarely heard her speak. They said she seemed more attentive to the sound of the trees than to people. Still, her presence was remembered as quiet, never hostile. The two maintained a discreet coexistence, with no recorded fights or rumors that might suggest hidden family tensions. Despite this seemingly stable daily life, preserved archives indicate a slow transformation in the sisters' domestic rhythm. Maren stopped attending the exchange fairs during the previous winter, claiming, according to a statement taken in 1924, that she had difficulty walking because of pain in her knees. However, this would not be enough to explain her complete absence, as the fair was less than a 2-hour walk away, and she had always been known for her discipline. Eliza, on the other hand, almost completely stopped going to the wax and flower exchange, a task she had previously performed punctually, even if she avoided conversation. The winter of 1900 to 1901 was harsher than usual, and many residents began to report that some families faced greater isolation than normal. This included the Hartwells. Maren and Eliza were seen less often, and when someone mentioned seeing them, they described them as tired or more withdrawn than usual. A local woodcutter stated years later that he once found Maren standing in front of the well, looking inside as if trying to remember something that had slipped her mind. The testimony is disputed by some historians, but it appears in 2 separate sources, indicating some verisimilitude. During that same period, rumors began to circulate that the sisters' house kept its lights on until very late. Lamps hanging inside the upper loft cast unsettling shadows through the cracks in the roof, visible from the road on clearer nights. Since the loft was only used to store old blankets and tools, this caught the attention of some residents, but not enough for anyone to investigate. In Pinehollow, excessive curiosity was seen as reckless, and everyone minded their own business. The records also mention seemingly mundane episodes that only became relevant in retrospect. A young woman passing through the area on her way to another community claimed to have seen a male figure approaching the Hartwell's house at nightfall, but was unable to describe his face. Another oral source says he heard voices coming from the loft, not in a tone of conflict, but as muffled conversations, impossible to understand from a distance. Such reports have never been officially confirmed, but they appear frequently in informal archives collected by local chroniclers. The strangest, however, is a note made by the former pastor of the region, who visited few homes and rarely wrote down personal details. In his diary from February 1901, there is a single line referring to the sisters. They seem to be waiting for something, although they cannot name what it is. The phrase is enigmatic and receives no further explanation. No other visits to the cottage were recorded in the following 2 months. This set of small clues, their absence from the markets, the lights on in the loft, the reports of voices and the sisters' silent demeanor, was, at the time, just a discrete noise in the daily life of the community. Nothing that justified suspicion nor interference. It was a time when entire families disappeared for weeks due to the weather, practical work, or the demands of the land. Pinehollow was not a place where absolute clarity about the lives of neighbors was expected. It was only when comparing these reports with later documents that historians realized the extent of what was going on. The days leading up to April 11th reveal in fragmented records long periods of isolation. No one entered or left the property for nearly 2 weeks, according to patrol notes made from a distance. The well remained unused for days. The outdoor fire showed no signs of recent ashes, and no footprints consistent with the movement of wagons or visitors were identified. The growing silence around the Hartwell house now seems like an inevitable prelude. The sisters followed their routines, but with a kind of withdrawal that the documents describe as an indecipherable wait. When the reports mention that, on the night of April 10th, lamps remained lit for long hours, creating an unusual glow through the high windows of the loft, no one could have imagined that this would be the last confirmed sign of activity in the residence. It is at this point that the file begins to darken. There are more gaps than certainties in the chronology of events. And although all the records are presented as factual, they lack a fundamental detail that researchers are still unable to fill in today. What really happened inside the Hartwell house in those silent hours before the disappearance? The night of April 10th to 11, 1901 was recorded in the county's weather reports as particularly cold for that time of spring. A mass of air descending from the Cumberland Mountains brought winds that swept through the treetops with a continuous whistle, long enough to drown out smaller sounds. In such conditions, it was common for families to put out their lamps early, conserving oil and avoiding risks. But in the case of the Hartwell sisters, the opposite happened. The lights remained on until well after midnight, casting irregular shadows along the outer boards of the upper loft. A farmer who lived about a kilometer away, and whose testimony was only recorded 29 years later, said he got up to check on his animals after hearing the wind shift some of the tiles on his barn. Looking toward the sisters' house, he saw a steady, unflickering glow, as if several lamps were lined up along the high windows. It was unusual, but not alarming. Not enough for him to cross the dark, uneven terrain to get there. Still, he noted that the light seemed to be concentrated in the loft, not in the kitchen or the lower rooms. Official records make no mention of any visitors at that time, and no contemporary accounts point to the sounds of horses' wheels or footsteps coming from the road. This makes the entry found in the patrol log even more puzzling. The one that indicates that 27 travelers rested in the Hartwell sisters' loft during the previous night. To this day, there is no plausible explanation for the origin of this number, nor for why such a note was made without any context. The reconstruction of the sisters' last confirmed moments is based on a set of fragments. A neighbor, who occasionally sold wool yarn to Maren, reported passing by the road on the afternoon of April 10th and seeing the back door of the house open, which was rare. She said that through a crack, she saw Maren leaning over the stove, as if she were heating something. Eliza, according to the same witness, was walking slowly inside the loft, carrying a cylindrical object that she could not identify. The scene seemed organized but tense to her, although she could not explain why. Another important fragment comes from a young apprentice of the local blacksmith, who claimed to have heard, on that same day, female voices near the stream, where the sisters occasionally washed clothes. He couldn't swear they were the Hartwells, but the height and rhythm of the voices were familiar. Curiously, the boy also claimed to have heard a third voice, deeper and slower, which he described as a tired man, perhaps exhausted. When questioned about this years later, he replied that it could have been just an echo from the valley, as the cold air created strange acoustic phenomena. As night fell, the wind picked up. Trees that normally stood still began to sway with sharp sounds, and the tall grass bent in waves. The Hartwell house, built of old, worn boards, creaked with each gust. Still, the lamps remained lit, revealing intermittent movement inside the loft. Shadows passing from one side to the other, sometimes pausing as if someone were standing by the window, just looking out. Around 11 o'clock, according to estimates based on the few reliable clocks in the area, the light flickered twice. It is a small detail, preserved only because the distant farmer made a point of noting it in his belated report. He described the flickering as a hesitant breath, as if someone had touched the lamp or closed an interior door. After that, the light remained steady. No testimony mentions any sound coming from the house after that time. There were no screams, falls, running footsteps, or any noise that could indicate conflict. On the contrary, everything suggests that the night passed in deep silence, broken only by the wind sweeping through the valley. The farmer himself stated that after observing the glow for a few minutes, he returned to his barn and did not look in that direction again. The most intriguing gap arises in the reconstruction of the hours between midnight and dawn. When the local patrol passed by the road on the morning of April 11th, as it did every other day, it recorded the Hartwell property as quiet and showing no signs of recent activity. The front door was ajar, not locked. The outdoor fire pit remained unlit, with old ashes piled up. There was an empty metal basin near the well, but no signs of recent use. Everything pointed to inactivity. Inside the house, according to the subsequent report, the kitchen table was set with 2 plates and 2 glasses, as if the sisters had prepared for a late meal that never took place. There was stale bread and a small jug of curdled milk. Nothing was knocked over or out of order. The environment, although cold, suggested sudden abandonment. Hanging clothes remained on the internal rope, and the kettle still contained remnants of darkened water. The upper loft presented the most enigmatic scene. There were blankets spread out on the floor, as if someone had used them during the night. Marks of displaced dust were found, indicating that objects had been moved but nothing had been taken. The inventory did not record the presence of more than 2 lamps, certainly not enough to illuminate the entire space as described by the farmer. Furthermore, there was no sign that other people had spent the night there. No additional footprints, no coats, no bags, no traces of food, no signs of human gathering, only emptiness. The patrol's statement about the 27 travelers therefore remains isolated and inexplicable. Some historians believe that the officer confused notes or transcribed numbers from another incident. Others argue that the information may have been based on unverified rumors. The fact is that such a record is not repeated in any other document and contrasts completely with the intact state of the loft. The exact point where the climax of events is concentrated is in a note written in faded ink, perhaps by the same officer, at the end of that morning's report. The house is in unusual order, but there are no signs of the sisters. There are no clues as to what happened between last night and dawn. The loft appears to have been occupied, but not by whom one would expect. It is this last sentence that arouses the greatest concern among researchers, for it suggests that, although there was no material evidence of visitors, something in the environment, perhaps the arrangement of objects, perhaps the officer's subjective feeling, indicated the presence of more than just 2 women on that silent dawn. An impression he was unable to detail, but which he recorded in a concise and disturbing manner. The final block of documentation ends right here, with a single line, unsigned, that seems to have been added moments before the file was saved. At dawn, only silence remained. In the days following the disappearance, the Pinehollow region experienced a rare period of activity. At that time, there were no formal search procedures, such as those that would be established decades later. However, the disappearance of 2 adult women, known for their stable routine and lack of conflict, aroused immediate concern. The Hartwell house became a constant point of visit for neighbors, curious onlookers, and members of the small local patrol who tried to decipher the silent marks left in the environment. The authorities' first effort was to establish a precise chronology. The last person to see the sisters alive, according to records, was the neighbor who had seen Maren and Eliza on the afternoon of April 10th. Her description, the back door open, the stove lit, slow movement in the loft, would be repeated several times in subsequent interrogations. She stated with conviction that there was nothing there to indicate fear, urgency, or the presence of third parties. Still, her observation took on new weight in light of the disappearance. The search of the surrounding area began simply. Trails were followed, the banks of the creek were analyzed, and natural ditches were examined. Nothing. No fresh footprints, no clothes, no evidence of sudden displacement. The more distant areas, where the brush reached waist height, were searched by volunteer groups with kerosene lanterns. At the end of the second day, the patrol noted that no traces were found. The valley seemed to have swallowed the sisters without a trace. As the hours passed, fragmented statements began to emerge from residents who, until then, had remained silent out of prudence. One man claimed to have seen two figures walking along the road before dawn on April 11th, but when questioned, he revealed that he was not sure they were women. Another claimed to have heard a muffled call coming from the direction of the loft a few nights before the disappearance. And there was also the account of a child, never officially considered, who said he had seen, through his bedroom window, shadows moving too fast on the Hartwell's property. All of these accounts were vague, inconclusive, and the patrol recorded them as peripheral noises, not clues. The confusion grew when the note about the 27 travelers began to circulate among residents. The officer in charge, a man named Lyle Carter, repeatedly stated that he did not remember why he had written that number or where he had gotten that information. In the preserved statements, his tone is hesitant, as if he were trying to mentally reconstruct a poorly heard statement or a misinterpreted rumor. Some historians believe that Carter intended to refer to another case of travelers seeking shelter near the county border and mistakenly transcribed the note into the wrong report. Others argue that the number may have come from an informal count of blankets, bundles, or objects in the loft, although this has never been proven. The central point, however, was not the number itself, but the atmosphere of contradictions. The patrol insisted that the loft appeared to have been used recently, but with no clear signs of who had occupied it. The lamps were clean and neatly arranged, as if someone had taken great care of them. The blankets were open, but showed no signs of human weight that would indicate prolonged rest. It was too organized a scene for a space that, according to all accounts, had been used only as a storage room. It was then that a more sensitive revelation emerged. Not as physical evidence, but as human memory. One of the later testimonies, collected in 1936, came from a former assistant pastor who lived in Pinehollow at the time, although he rarely appeared in official documents. He reported that, weeks before her disappearance, Maren had privately asked him to stop insisting on pastoral visits. He said she seemed tired and carrying a weight that had no form, without mentioning illness or practical problems. At the time, his statement did not attract attention, but combined with the sisters' sudden seclusion in the following months, it became a relevant emotional fragment. The interpretation most accepted by some researchers is that Maren and Eliza had been going through a period marked by extreme fatigue, perhaps emotional, perhaps physical. Their increasing isolation, reduced outdoor activities, and the fact that they kept their lamps lit late into the night may indicate that they were trying to cope with something that was never directly recorded in the archives. A deep, silent exhaustion that worsened without witnesses or confidences. The possibility that the two were caring for each other, perhaps facing a chronic illness, perhaps an emotional breakdown motivated by the harsh winter, became a plausible hypothesis in subsequent studies. Another interpretation, albeit rarer, suggests that the sisters may have offered temporary shelter to a lone traveler lost in the region, someone who has never been identified. As Pinehollow was on the route of sporadic migrants, it would not be impossible for someone to have knocked on the door, seeking protection from the cold. This hypothesis would explain the movement in the loft and the sensation observed by the officer, but it lacks any material confirmation. No objects belonging to third parties were found, and no reports of missing travelers coincide with the date. After 2 weeks of searching, the official conclusion was laconic: prolonged absence without cause. The Hartwell sisters were considered missing, and the house remained closed until distant relatives came to collect some belongings years later. The loft, according to the late inventory, was exactly as it had been left on that quiet April morning. The most revealing element, though discreet, only emerged in the last review of the files by the county in 1919. Among yellowed documents, there was a loose sheet containing a single sentence, probably written by someone who visited the house in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. The handwriting is irregular, and the ink almost faded, but the words remain legible. They seemed ready to leave long before they actually did. This observation, perhaps the most human of the entire case, has become the cornerstone of modern interpretations. It indicates that, although no one clearly noticed, Maren and Eliza may have already been distancing themselves from their social circle, their home, and their routine long before the dawn, when the valley woke up without them. There is no evidence of violence, organized escape, or the presence of strangers. Instead, there is a persistent impression of two lives that gradually withdrew into an irreversible silence. The mystery remains not because of a lack of clues, but because the clues never converged, and because the only consistent evidence, the serene and tidy state of the house, reveals less about what happened that night than about what had been quietly accumulating in the previous months. The block ends with the observation recorded by one of the county's last investigators. If there was an answer, it is hidden in what they did not say. When the Pinehollow archives were reorganized in the 1920s, few residents still remembered the Hartwell sisters clearly. The years had brought slow but steady changes. Families had left, others had arrived. Trails had been altered by the movement of cattle, and the hillsides had suffered minor erosion that had erased old marks. The sisters' shack, however, remained there, motionless, silent, almost untouched, strangely resistant to time, as if waiting for someone to one day decipher the gaps left in its final months. The researcher tasked with reviewing the case described in his notes the feeling of entering the old house. The air was cold, still, carrying the fine dust that had accumulated on the floorboards. Each step echoed as if it could be heard by someone upstairs, even though he knew the loft had been empty for over 20 years. The table was still there, with circular marks that betrayed the weight of old glasses. The small window above the sink let in a ray of light that split into suspended particles. There was nothing extraordinary about the environment, and perhaps that was precisely what caused him constant discomfort, the normality, the absence of disturbance. In his final notes, he observed that the real enigma of the case was not the disappearance itself, but the quietude that preceded it, the way the sisters were consumed by such deep seclusion that no one knew how to interpret it, while there was still time. In the valley, seclusion was common, silence was part of life. But the Hartwell's solitude seemed to have exceeded the expected limits, becoming something denser, more lasting, something that, in the end, could not be reversed. Researchers who revisited Pinehollow in the following decades mentioned that the community, even years later, avoided talking about the case, not out of fear, but out of respect. It was as if there was a tacit understanding that the sisters' disappearance did not belong to the realm of crime, nor to that of sudden tragedies. It was a kind of slow dissolution, built up over months, perhaps years, and culminating in that silent dawn when the valley woke up without them. The note about the 27 travelers, so often highlighted by the curious, lost its significance over time. Today it is seen as an administrative noise, or as the reflection of a transcription error by someone tired at the end of their shift. The absence of any physical evidence in its favor turned it into a mere detail, while the rest of the case remained linked to the weight of the unspeakable. The story of the Hartwell sisters did not survive because of the strangeness of the note, but because of the profound humanity that emanated from their discrete lives. In some reviews, historians have attempted to reconstruct the emotional trajectory of the two women from the few preserved testimonies. The severe cold of the previous winter, the reduction in trips to the market, the visible fatigue in Maren's eyes, Eliza's silent strangeness, the lamps lit late into the night. All these fragments form a possible, albeit incomplete, narrative. A narrative of two women who may have faced something they could not name, and who decided to face it together in the reserved manner that always characterized their existence. The house, even decades later, remained a testament to this process. The 1920 researcher described the loft as the place where time seemed to have stopped at the moment immediately before the disappearance. The blankets on the floor, the faint smell of aged wood, the arrangement of the lamps, none of these elements offered answers. But they all carried a kind of silent memory, a sense that the sisters had spent their last hours there, perhaps talking, perhaps just sharing the weight of a common weariness. The few personal items found, an unfinished piece of crochet, a book with a worn spine, a sewing box with threads lined up by color, suggest lives as simple as they were fragile. Lives that did not seek prominence, nor leave extensive marks on the collective memory. And yet, the silence surrounding them spanned decades, stronger than the sound of any noisy story. The researcher, on his last visit to the shack before finalizing the file, wrote a sentence that would become the definitive conclusion of the case. Some disappearances do not echo because they are strange, but because they are too human. This sentence, carefully preserved among the restored documents, summarizes the modern understanding of what happened in Pinehollow. The disappearance of the Hartwell sisters is not seen as an extraordinary event, but rather as the end point of a trajectory marked by isolation, emotional exhaustion, and a gradual return to the silence from which they may never have truly emerged. Leaving the cottage that afternoon, the researcher noted that the sunlight streamed through the half-open door, illuminating only the lower part of the table, as if the rest of the house preferred to remain in darkness. He walked slowly to the road, breathed in the cold air coming down from the mountains, and, without looking back, concluded that there was nothing left there that could be recovered. Over time, the community accepted this conclusion. Pinehollow moved on, at its usual slow pace, as if it understood that for certain types of silence, no investigation can dissolve them. And so, at the end of the last pages of the file, there remains only the constant feeling that the sisters left in the same way they lived, discreet, serene, walking to a place where no one could follow them. The text ends without explanations, without theories, without additional lines. Just one last sentence, as simple as the valley always was, and everything remained quiet.